As soon as I finished up our review of the Losi Super Rock Rey, look what shows up on my doorstep. A Baja Rey. How cool is that? This is just an awesome looking 1/10 scale 4-wheel drive electric desert truck, and I can't wait to run this thing. I mean, this Raptor body, completely awesome. The Black Rhino livery, very cool. Even love the Black Rhino rims on this. I just can't wait to see this truck running. So you know what? Rather than go through the usual format of our RC driver videos, I'm going to go and run the action right now so you can see this thing just tearing up the dirt. And then after that, we'll go and talk about the features. And of course, I'll wrap up the end of the video with my performance report. So let's get into some of the features of the Raptor Baja Rey, and you know what? Let's start off with the Spectrum radio system that it comes with. This is the DX2E. We've seen it in a number of ready-to-run vehicles from Losi, and it works really well. It has all the basic functions you're going to need as far as trims and reversing, and even an AVC knob here to adjust the AVC in the car, and a great little radio system, and it is expandable now with Spectrum's telemetry module stuff, so definitely check that out on the Spectrum website. Now, it does come with a manual. If you're new to RC, definitely read through this. Has all the important information you're going to need to get going. And then we've got some AA batteries for the radio system. That is pretty neat. And then there was this plastic part that I saw when I was emptying out the box, and I'm like, what is this thing for? Finally figured it out. I think it's basically a cover here for the front LED light. So if you're running during the daytime, you could go and block out the lights. Who runs lights during the day? All right, and finally, we've got this little bag here of stuff. This, I believe, is just a battery spacer. I couldn't really find too much detail on it anywhere. It comes with a optional pinion gear. It does have some inserts for servos, so if you do go and pick up a different servo to run in this, and it has a different spline, you could swap out the inserts here. It's got a screw for this little block. I assume it's a battery block, and then, of course, the bind plug. And that's really, you know, and you get the truck as well, but that's really about it. You're going to need a battery and a charger, just so you are aware. Yes, it's a ready-to-run vehicle, but you do have to choose your own battery and charger for it. You can get a 2S LiPo or a 3S LiPo. We're going with a 3S Dynamite pack here, and of course, you're going to need a charger of your choice. All right, now we could take a look at the truck itself. And here, do you see that? You see, look how much suspension travel in the rear of this thing. I absolutely love it already. But I want to talk to you about the body first. This new Raptor body on here. The old Baja Rey had a pretty cool looking body to it. I like the graphics on there, but this thing is over the top. They have two different liveries for it. Obviously, we have the Black Rhino here, and this just looks super cool. Multiple body panels. We got the front hood and fender section, got the cab section, then we got the rear fenders on it. Very neat looking. We got the, you know, the graphics of the Black Rhino livery, you know, the Black Rhino decals all over here, even some Losi decals, a bunch of sponsor decals in the center, and it just looks awesome. But what really sets it off is this mean looking Raptor grille in the front. This is a separate molded piece. Very cool. Same with the hood louvers here. That is a separate piece, and overall it just looks awesome. And then inside, of course, we've got the drivers that we saw on the Baja Rey before. Molded cockpit, basically, a few decals. The driver's heads in there are a molded plastic, and you know they help set off the look of the vehicle. Out in the back here, yes, this is a functional spare tire. Gotta have it on a desert truck. It just, you know, really sets off the look. Here, I'm just going to show you guys again. Look at the suspension travel on it. Super cool. But as far as the outside graphics and details of the body, Losi knocked it out of the park with this. You know what, I'm going to jump right over to the wheels and tires. You know, we've seen these tires before. Nice, soft, compound, large lug tire that we saw on the Baja Rey before. But now we have Black Rhino replica wheels on here, and these just look killer. I kind of want these for my real Jeep if I could get them for it. But very cool stuff going on. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to go and pull all the body panels off so we could talk about the inside details of this vehicle. There are a bunch of screws and body washers to pull off. Gonna take me a few minutes. I'm gonna get to work. Well, I went a little crazy when I had the power driver in my hands, and I wound up taking the roll cage off as well. But you know what? It allows me to show you the inside of the truck a little bit better. But why don't we start off by talking about the inner cage here. It's a multiple piece cage, and it looks the part. It looks super scale. Very cool setup here. I know a lot of people like to pull the body panels off their truck and just run the cage. And you know what? You could actually go and pull some of these support structures off as well, so it gives it a cooler look. As you can see here, we've got a front light bar and a rear light bar as well. And you know what? While I was pulling this apart, I finally figured out what that little block was in the bag that I showed you before. This is basically like a filler valve. You can go and pull the spare tire post off, put the block in its place, and it gives it a cooler look, you know, if you don't want to run the spare tire on there. Pretty neat stuff, Losi. Now, let's talk about the truck details, and it looks kind of funky without all the bodywork and roll cage on there, but you know what? It's all business. So up front, we've got this simple desert style bumper. Definitely absorbs impact from endos and stuff like that, but my eye goes right to these cool looking blue shocks, or blue detail shocks, I should say. The body itself is a plastic composite. It is threaded, so you can go and adjust the spring preload on there. There's some bump stops on the bottom, pretty long travel. Neat looking shock. I probably would have liked to have seen an aluminum shock on here. It does have an aluminum upper cap, but you know what? I think with a truck with all the features it has on it, a aluminum body would have really set off the shock package on this. But it feels really smooth, and I'm sure it gets the job done. The truck does come with sway bars front and actually rear. And what really catches my eye is the suspension arm setup here. A dual A arm setup, and it goes right out to the steering knuckle. It's got a captured ball end at the end. And what I really like about this setup is less parts. And less parts means less possible breakage, and it looks very scaled. The arms are nice and smooth. The lower arm actually has a top insert in it, kind of like a racing arm. And, you know, very cool overall. The steering knuckles look pretty stout. And what's really neat at the end are some faux disc brakes and some calipers. It looks really cool through the Black Rhino wheels. Now, universals up front. How cool is that? You know, no dog bones, no plastic sliders up front here, just some steel drive shafts out to ball bearings. We do have a gear differential in the front here. Actually, there's a gear differential in the front, center, and rear. It's an open rear, so it's not like a locked up like the Rock Rey has. So we've got open differentials in here, which means you can go and tune them. They are sealed, and of course they have all metal gears in them. You know, you have to with a 3S vehicle here with a 3800 kV motor in it. But let's get back to the front of the vehicle. Pretty sturdy looking shock tower in the front. Not a lot of, well, pretty much no shock tuning options at all. So I hope, you know, Losi had the geometry down right on this vehicle. And since it's been out for a while, people seem to really like the old truck. So I'm sure this one handles just fine. Twin bell crank steering in the center here. What I did notice though, guys, you know, when I was messing around with this car, there is a lot of flex in that steering crank setup. So maybe that's something to watch out for. It does have a servo saver setup in there, but the cranks themselves, they do flex a lot. So I don't know if that's going to cause any, you know, erratic feel when you're driving it or some durability issues. Just something to keep in mind. Pretty neat little dirt guards that we got here for the chassis, and the chassis itself is aluminum. It's a stamped aluminum plate, countersunk screws. It's got this little press bend section in the center, kind of like a channel to help, you know, make it more rigid, and then it's got a aluminum top plate in the center to really just make the chassis nice and sturdy. Over here is where the battery goes, and the battery is actually accessed through the back here. There's a little tab you slide over and you slide the battery in, and they actually have a spacer in there from the factory, so it's set up for a 2S LiPo battery, and then you go pull that spacer out if you want to run a 3S, which is what we're going to do. So you don't have to take the body off in order to get to the battery. It's all accessed through the back here. All right, now also in the center, we've got a steel center drive shaft to that center differential I told you about, all metal gears in there, and then a metal motor plate to support the motor. Very cool stuff going on. The motor actually drops out from the bottom, so if you want to access this to change out the pinion gear, that's what you do. You drop it out through the bottom. So that should make working on it a bit easier. Again, taking off this body and the roll cage on here is a lot of work if you're doing it with just a handheld screwdriver. All right, I skipped over the servo, so we've got a 9 kg servo in here, which I think translated to 124 inches of torque. Pretty decent for a ready to run. It is waterproof, and you know, it's from the Spectrum brand, which you would expect, you know, from a Horizon vehicle. Since we're talking about electronics, 130 amp dynamite fuse speed controller in here. I can see an aluminum heatsink in there, big cooling fan on top. The wires run over to an EC3 connector, so be aware of that when you're getting a battery pack for it. You're going to need an EC3 plug on it. And then tucked away right behind the speed controller is an SRS 6000 ABC receiver. So that's your active vehicle control. It gives your vehicle a little bit of electronic assist to keep your vehicle under control, like when you're accelerating through the turns and stuff like that. And that is adjustable, so you could go and turn that trim knob on your radio system to mess around with that depending on the type of driving experience that you want. The rear section here, the rear bulkhead section, pretty rigid setup. It kind of integrates into the cage work, and it of course is your shock tower post as well. There's your rear shocks, just a longer version of the front shocks. Now onto the 4-link rear suspension. We've got a sway bar in the back, as I mentioned earlier. We've got these, you know, bulky looking lower links, and then plastic upper links. Kind of what probably would have liked to have seen a metal upper link there too, but you know, these are pretty stiff, so I kind of take that back. You know, for out of the box, that's actually pretty impressive. So let me move on to the rear axle. Check that thing out. That has got a wide stance to it, and you know, inside again, we got a metal gear differential, ball bearings. It's an open diff, and actually that feels really smooth. So they did a great job. It's got I think it's got a heavier grease in there. So that actually just feels like it's going to work really well. No tuning needed there. In the center here is the drive shaft. It is a plastic drive shaft in the center, but the ends here are steel. So you know, that's the important part. This could possibly twist, but I'm sure you're going to have to put a lot of stress on it, and it may take away some of the stress of, you know, when this thing is running through the dirt and stuff. But overall, I like the way everything looks. We've got basically a fake radiator fan set up back here just to add to the scale details. There's our on-off switch with a little rubber boot on there. A bunch of the electronics are waterproof. The speaker controller is waterproof. The servo is waterproof. The motor's waterproof, I believe I saw. I don't know about the receiver. It is kind of chilling out back here, so might want to be careful of that. But again, I love the way this thing looks all together. Yeah, I think Losi did a great job on it, especially putting that Raptor body on there. Now this just leaves, you know, talking about the performance, so why don't we get into that? Now, before we get into the performance, I do want to mention to you guys, when you watch the action footage of this, every time you saw this vehicle without the spare tire on the rear, that's when I was running it on 2S with the factory 13-tooth pinion gear. Every time you saw it with the spare tire on there, it was running on 3S with the optional 10-tooth pinion that's included with the kit. All right, now that that's out of the way, let's start off with talking about the power of this thing, and I'll start off with the 2S. And you know what? This thing is really fast on 2S. In fact, it's enjoyably fast on 2S. Sometimes, you know, it's kind of borderline. No, this thing is actually pretty ridiculous on 2S. It roosts dirt. It flies through the air. It's got a lot of power. You know, so if the thought of 3S kind of scares you, maybe you're getting into the hobby, you're still maybe sort of new to this, you want this cool truck, 2S is definitely fine. I love the performance on it. Now on 3S, it's a whole nother level of power. This thing is just insane. And I have to say, I think this quickly became one of my favorite trucks to drive, especially on 3S. It's just purely insane. Actually let a buddy of mine drive it as well, and his jaw just dropped when he squeezed the trigger on it on 3S, and it is really, really cool. Now, the only thing about the 3S power, and I noticed this on the 3S power, is the tires. The tires are pretty soft on this. I mentioned that earlier, and the problem with that is they really start to expand on when you run on a 3S to the point where it starts like grabbing onto the body and stuff and hanging up on the body and makes horrible noises and stuff like that. You know, traction's actually pretty good. I like the tire, but it's just that growth. So, you know, that's just something to keep in mind. I don't suspect it should deter you from this vehicle at all, but power-wise, this thing is incredible. And you know, just keep your temperatures in check, check your motor, check your speed controller, make sure everything's fine, especially if you start messing with gears and stuff like that. You know, I do suggest going over to that 10-tooth pinion. If you're going to run it on 3S, you know, maybe if you're going to do a couple speed runs, you could go with the 13. But my experience, like with the Losi Tenacity T and MT, is if you run that larger pinion on this motor with a hotter battery, things tend to get pretty hot in there. So just take the time and you know, check your temperatures on stuff as you're driving. Onto the steering of it, it steers pretty well. I think I would like something with a bit more torque in the servo department here. The steering just seemed to be kind of lazy with this. The turns were kind of wide. You know, I had a lot of fun with it still. But I probably would have liked a bit tighter steering, and there is some flex in there. I mentioned that before, and that might be taking up some of it. Maybe the servo saver needs to be tightened down a little bit. But for out of the box, it works fine. For bashing, it's fine. You know, for someone like me that has raced a lot, I'm looking to carve some more tighter corners, and that's where I probably would have liked a little bit better of a steering setup in this, especially with all the power that it has. Now to the jumping and handling, you know, that long suspension travel, super cool, especially when you're flying by yourself and you know, let's say the road is really ruddy, you can just see the suspension dropping out as the chassis itself is, you know, lifting up. It's very, very cool. Onto the jumping part of it, it actually jumps really well. And with this solid rear axle setup, you tend to get a lot of buck out of the rear. That's just, you know, inherent of this style of suspension setup and axle setup. But this was actually, you know, a lot better than some other vehicles I've driven with this type of setup. It actually flew pretty level for the most part. Now, some of those steep jumps, it did buck up the rear off of that, and what you have to do is really just hold on to the trigger and, you know, pray that it pulls itself out of a nosedive. I did do some nasty nosedives with this, but it, you know, it survived it. But for the most part, over like nice gradual ramps, you know, this thing just soared nice and flat, and I did keep on the throttle while doing that. You know, I knew that it was going to drop the nose, so I just kept the throttle on, and it just kept flying nice and level and landed really, really well. So I did like the suspension, but I do have to, you know, tell you guys one thing about the suspension. You need to reset the preload collars on the truck after your first or second run, because the suspension just settles in and it just starts riding basically chassis on the ground. It needs those preload collars adjusted. So look at this. Push it down and it's like not even coming back up. So I do have to go in here and adjust it, maybe pull the body off and reset the ride height. But I think once I reset the ride height, it should be fine after that. So I just wanted to let you guys know about that. Keep an eye on that after your first few runs. And finally, that leaves durability, and this thing is a beast. I mean, the front arms are chipped up from hitting rocks, and I have to tell you, there was probably about a half a dozen times where I hit something, I even hit a tree, and I was like, I'm just going to go over and collect some parts, and there was nothing broken on this. So I think this is pretty tough. I was a little bit worried about that steering, as I told you guys earlier, but you know, no breakage issues. You know, I hit a tree. There's nothing wrong with the front. I actually had to dig bark out of the front of the grill. That's how hard I hit it. But nothing seems to be bent. Nothing seems to be broken. A spring on one of the shocks shifted, but that's really about it. There is something I do need to tell you about, though. My first run with it, right out of the box, it was making a really loud grinding gear noise. I could just tell that the gear pitch was not set properly, and I pulled the motor out and I looked at it, and it was a 13-tooth pinion gear, and it was in the 13-tooth index on the motor mount, but it was just not meshing properly. So I did remove the motor and I clocked it over to the 14-tooth pinion slot, put it back in, and it was nice and quiet. It didn't seem to have too much gear lash in there. And, you know, that's the way I ran it on the 13-tooth every single time. You know, the reason why I want to tell you that is if your truck has a loud whining noise, like, you know, the gear mesh is too tight, stop before you overheat anything. Check it out. You know, maybe move the motor like I did. You don't want to burn anything out. That's when things get expensive. And I've dinged this truck for a couple things over this review portion, but overall, this is now one of my favorite trucks to drive. It is really cool. It's fast. The suspension work on it is completely awesome. It just looks cool with the body panels on here, and I'm going to run this truck a lot. This is really a lot of fun. I'm really excited that I got an opportunity to drive the Baja Rey, and if you're looking for a cool truck to add to your collection, I think you should check it out too. What'd you do, Jim?
I just trying to get you good footage.